Sure.
Yeah, it works. Cool. Okay. Hello, everyone. This is SIG-cluster-lifecycle on the 19th of September 2017. Let's see what's on the agenda. There are two items on the agenda. First one is from Matt.
I'm sorry, I would like to postpone until Grant joins the meeting. Brian Grant, he said he was going to join, so he's not here yet. So maybe we can let the other agenda item first.
No problems. So that's from Caleb. Caleb, do you want to talk about this?
Yep. Just a gentle reminder. Can everyone hear me, first of all? Cool. Just a gentle reminder to add your SIG development themes for the 1.8 release to the 1.8 release notes draft as soon as possible. It's just sentences, a brief expository text on what the SIG is chartered to do, and then another sentence about what the SIG was focused on for 1.8. And there are existing examples from SIG node, SIG instrumentation, SIG auto scaling. SIG storage has a PR up as well.
I thought Lucas had done this a long time ago. We had originally had a 1.8 release draft notes done.
Yeah, Lucas did the release notes, but not like the sort of SIG summary part, right? Which changed for this release about a week ago. So I think before he went out, he volunteered me on Friday to do that, and I will tell you.
All right.
Cool. So that's Robert taking that one then.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And Caleb, thank you for the reminder. Cool. Does anyone have any items other than Matt's item for the agenda today?
Actually, my item can now come up. Brian's joined the meeting.
Oh, awesome.
Welcome.
Okay, great. Hey, Brian.
Okay, so last week we discussed incubation of CubeSpray, its potential graduation, and what it means for this SIG, because this is the SIG that would be associated with any installers. And so some months ago, COPS passed incubation, which is amazing. But it seems that there's some sort of roadblock to allowing any others through. Brian sent a mail through recently saying that we should pause any sort of incubation movement now. But we want to discuss what does this SIG's role? What is the SIG's role with the installers? How do we bless installers, and should they be tied to Q Adm? My feeling is yes, but maybe it's not a hard requirement. Maybe first let Brian say something and then just take some open feedback from the group.
We can't hear you, Brian.
How about now?
Yeah.
You guys.
Okay. Just unplug my headset so I don't have to figure out how to switch the microphone. Yeah, I can speak to two. So first, why did we put things on hold? So the vote, an email will go out imminently if it hasn't gone out already. That's what I was doing the past few minutes, is reviewing the announcement. The vote for the steering committee is happening now. So the Bootstrap committee wants to postpone changes of policy until the full steering committee can participate. And in particular, with respect to the incubation process, it's become clear as we exercise the process over the past year that there are some major issues with it, especially recently. So we are going to have to, I think, change the process to fix some of the issues around how decisions actually made around projects entering and exiting incubation. So we're just saying that we want to do that with the full steering committee. The vote will close in a couple of weeks, so it shouldn't be tremendously long. So that's the reason for the freeze. So with respect to the cluster provisioning and Bootstrap tools specifically, we've had Cube in the Kubernetes repo from the beginning of the project. That was mostly a matter of expedience. Everything started in the Kubernetes repo in the beginning of time, including talks and everything else. and we've been steadily moving things out. In the architectural roadmap, the cluster lifecycle tools fall into the ecosystem, as we definitely expect that there won't be just one. They're outside of Kubernetes proper. There will be different ones for different cloud providers. If there's a service like Container Engine, for example, or Azure Container Service, things like that. There will be multiple distributions and so on. However, I feel that there needs to be a reference implementation of at least one set of tools. I think Q Adm was designed to decouple provisioning and bootstrapping so that we could have a simple bootstrapping mechanism that would work on any infrastructure. And Q Adm itself provides kind of a reference implementation. It's not necessarily the only implementation, but it's a reference implementation for common cluster lifecycle tasks that need to be performed. I know there is an ongoing effort to get more of the provisioning and management tools to Adm, and that's great because it will lead to greater consistency. I think while there won't be just a single tool, like some people may want to build a cluster by hand from existing infrastructure with just a couple machines. Other people, if you have a large cluster, you need to automate that. If you're, especially if you are creating a cluster on a cloud, you also need a provisioning solution, which might be Terraform or it might be more sophisticated than that. So I think there will be a spectrum of tools. Ideally, there would be building blocks like Q Adm, but possibly other things as well that these tools could share. One could imagine building a stack similar to Kubernetes itself, for example, that has a declarative API. They could build CLIs and UIs and other things on top. Today, the situation is that if it's CLI-based, it's probably a client-only implementation. It's UI-based, same thing, and they don't share a lot of infrastructure. So I think there is space for consolidation amongst the solutions. That said, for something like COPS, which combines provisioning and bootstrapping and more sophisticated lifecycle management operations into a single tool, it has to make some decisions and have some opinions about how it does things, and which may not work for all environments. Like in particular, immutable VM images and destructive updates versus mutable images and in-place updates is kind of a fundamental decision that is going to be different in different environments. And I feel like KubeSpray and COPS make different decisions there, and that's fine. COPS, for what it's worth, is the #1 most active Kubernetes subproject out of any kind of subproject, right? So there's a lot of activity there. It's being ported to multiple cloud providers. KubeUp, I think, is still by far has the most cloud providers that has been ported to, but we need to get rid of it. It's a maintenance nightmare, and it definitely needs to come out of the Kubernetes repo, regardless of whether it continues to exist in some form. It would be useful to have an alternate tool that's been ported to several different cloud providers and solves the provisioning and management problems beyond what Q Adm does. As far as what we do with the lifecycle tools going forward, we need to have something at minimum that we can use to run end-to-end tests. So KubeUp has played that role in the past. It will not play that role forever. It has to get removed from the Kubernetes repo. It has to get removed from the release bundle. It has to get out of the end-to-end test frameworks. But we are going to need something that can create clusters and perform management operations for end-to-end tests, for upgrade tests, for rollback tests, and so on. I think it's I haven't talked to SIG testing. I don't know what the current thinking is there about what we would plan to do there. But I think a few, in addition to just having something that could be used for end-to-end tests, having a couple reference implementations with different styles of cluster management is going to be useful going forward. Ideally, we wouldn't have 10 because that's just too confusing, but having a couple very significantly different implementations that we believe are going to be widely useful, I think still looks like a reasonable thing to me. So I think I'm done.
All right, so a couple of things that I wanted to add there. I don't think it's a goal of this particular group have graduated from incubation and be a sub-project. I'd like to, to break that assumption. I mean, things can be active parts of the community without being an official Kubernetes sub-project. So there shouldn't be this rush to really get things through the incubation process so that they can be official. There is no mark of officialness there. There's history that we're going to have to deal with here. I mean, there are places where decisions were made on the past in terms of sub-projects, and there's some questions and some clarity that needs to be brought there in terms of what are the rights and responsibilities for those projects. So that's an ongoing process that's going to take the steering committee to actually get that stuff figured out.
Yeah, if you look, there's a backlog in the steering repo of things the steering committee needs to decide on, and there are a number of issues that relate to this. For example, how do we manage sub-projects that are significantly different from the Kubernetes repo, aren't included in the release bundle, have different development processes? How do we make decisions about code that's being donated to the project? So yeah, those sorts of decisions are up in the air, and whether a project has graduated from incubation or not is not going to have much relevance in terms of what decisions we make in the future with respect to which projects are going to be managed by the broader Kubernetes project versus separately, independently run.
And then the other point is that we do need something to replace KubeUp for sure. There are a certain set of requirements for a project to be successful for end users to manage a cluster over the lifetime of that cluster. And there's a certain set of requirements for a cluster that we're going to really poke in depth for like EDE tests, where we'll do a bunch of really nasty things to inject faults and stuff like that. And the number of options and sort of tweaks and the way that those things get tweaked, as we've seen sort of KubeUp sort of mutate over time and collect more and more options, I'm not sure that those set of requirements between sort of something to replace KubeUp for end-to-end tests and something that's going to be sort of really useful for end users, I'm not sure that a single system can actually meet both of those needs. So I think that's something that it's worth, us as a group talking about in terms of really mapping out what the different requirements there are.
So with that regard, yes, that's one of the, most people would regard as downsides to KubeSpray is that there are actually hundreds of configurable options, like setting CPU limits and requests and image tags and paths for every single command is an option, but the majority of them you don't need to change. So keeping it flexible, but trying to minimize how big that, master configurable options are, the one that users are more likely to change. Keeping that down is one of our goals, but really everything is quite flexible. I'm sure I'd like to see what gets configured in KubeUp that's required for EDE testing, and I'm sure it wouldn't be difficult at all to extend the KubeSpray project to meet this requirement, and that's one of my kind of interest right now is to find out what needs to be done if we were to pose ourselves as a reference installer.
There are some conflations in the end-to-end tests that shouldn't be there. They were never originally there, and they've grown over time because of some of the tests that people wanted to run in automation. So in reality, we should probably start separating out pieces of the end-to-end test, because in their original form, they were behavioral level tests of the system and not necessarily destruct deployment tests. And we can parcel those pieces out. But the requirement, I debate whether or not we want to conflate the requirements for all the things that exist inside the end-to-end test on sort of a single install tool. Because as Joe mentioned earlier, like having one tool do all these things and have all these options it's an owner's task, right?
Well, in particular, if we wanted to test both destructive updates and in-place updates of nodes, that might not be the same tool.
Yeah.
So yeah, we may very well need multiple tools.
And and again, I don't want to have this particular SIG necessarily picking winners on this. So even if we do have a tool that we lean on for the end-to-end stuff, I don't want end users to necessarily come away from that thinking that, well, this is the official tool for doing installs.
Well, there is a section on the site, and QSpray is already listed there as an option alongside KOPS and QBUP and QAdm. So that image is already there today.
We list a lot of tools that aren't even part of the Kubernetes project and service distributions.
And one of the things that we've been talking about as a way to sort of relieve some of the pressure and the desire for the incubation process would to have some sort of place where we can index and find and have people sort of discover these tools, so that we can start mapping out the ecosystem without having to have a bunch of sort of manual updates. Like, because I don't think anybody here is comfortable with that installer page. I don't think we're all super happy with what that looks like right now.
Yeah, I think we're discussing reducing it dramatically.
Yeah. And again, it's going to be one of these things where every time where we end up in a situation where there's multiple vendor choices, we hit this situation where we don't want to pick winners. And that's just sort of the nature of the open source project. If you go through the guides for using which network with Q Admin, you'll see that there are pains to make sure that it's relatively, even though like Luke here works for Weave and has done a ton of work to get Q Admin up, we're still trying to keep a certain amount of separation between when we guide people to vendors versus sort of what are the sort of overarching tools. And that's something
I would love to see the SIG first of all adopt something like Kelsey's Kubernetes the hard way.
I've talked to Kelsey about this, by the way, Brian, but yes, I agree.
And describe how you do it manually, and then kind of characterize this base of solutions and identify solutions that make sense in terms of directions. Like, we think it makes sense to have a tool that does it this way and a tool that does it that way. And work with SIG testing on whether those end user tools meet the needs of end-to-end, or whether we need an even more flexible toolbox for end-to-end test. I think before, there are other projects that are already in incubation relating to cluster lifecycle, and I don't want, like I said, 10 projects kind of operating in parallel with not much overlapping components. So before we do have too many, I think we need to understand what we want and what makes sense.
Okay. One comment regarding what you said about what installers should do. That was basically the topic of the first SIG cluster lifecycle meeting, and that topic was basically shelved forever because QAdm took the forefront. So that kind of says no. All installers really need to use QAdm rather than let's make a list. It'd be cool if that this SIG switched back to that theme, but it hasn't. And then,
where did you get the idea that all installers need to use QAdm?
Well,
QAdm also doesn't,
pointing in that way. But everyone's pointing in that direction.
QAdm doesn't do everything.
I know.
I think, Matt, the reason that we are trying to build QAdm so people will want to use it, right? So that you don't have to rebuild the parts of the infrastructure that QAdm does for you.
Yeah.
Right? I think there's never been a mandate that thou shalt must use it. I think it's more, as a community, we would like to consolidate at some levels of the install process so that we aren't all reinventing the wheel.
And for example, I think it'll make the tools more robust. Like if we use Q Adm as a end-to-end test, then operations like updating a node, rolling back a node, updating the master, rolling back a master, updating add-ons, rolling back add-ons, whatever, those things will be tested. And so if you use that as a building block, you'll at least know that what you're doing has more robust testing. Like I can't tell you how many issues are uncovered just because of the sheer volume of tests that we run. We run thousands and thousands of tests a day. That exposes issues that lighter amounts of testing just don't expose.
Okay, so we've basically established that this SIG is not going to endorse installers. The steering committee is not going to graduate installers. So what is the state of such projects? Should they move out of the Kubernetes space, or should there be a new space made?
Well, projects are not graduating. That is only hopefully for like a single-digit number of weeks.
Okay. Assuming they start graduating, but then we've established this SIG is not going to endorse any, and as SIG needs to back a project's graduation.
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by endorse, though, right? Like having a project under Kubernetes, like the dashboard. Let's look at the Kubernetes dashboard. It is a Kubernetes project. It is has people from multiple companies in the community working on it. But is it endorsed? I mean, there are lots of Kubernetes services and distributions that don't run the dashboard. They have their own UIs.
So, and I'll give you an example. I think I'm uncomfortable. I think one of the things that I want to figure out as we actually sort of, unfreeze the incubation sub-project is how can the Kubernetes name and how does being a sub-project, how can that be communicated to users? Right now, Helm, for example, bills itself as the Kubernetes package manager. Now, there can be multiple package managers for Kubernetes. I don't think we necessarily want to denote something as being the solution for this. I think there's probably a level of endorsement there that I'm not super comfortable with.
Although it does happen to be the only one under active development.
It is, okay, but I mean, maybe that's, but I get, do we let people say that, like, if they're a sub-project, they are the solution in that space? I don't think that we're going to get to the point where we have, this is the Kubernetes installer. I just don't think that that's in the cards, and I don't think that that's a good thing for the community. Now, that being said, that's a discussion for the steering committee to have once it's actually in and we can actually understand and sort of really rethink the outlines of what sub-projects and the incubation project means. How do we communicate that? What are the rights and responsibilities of those projects? And then we back propagate that to the existing sub-projects.
Yeah, I think the responsibilities part is important that you touched on, because I think that with sort of the benefits you get from being sort of in the official Kubernetes space, there presumably has to come some sort of responsibilities for maintaining your project, maybe in some sort of consistent way with the other set of projects, hopefully to be defined by the steering committee, that some people aren't going to want to follow those processes and aren't going to want to be, sort of stuck in that project space, right?
Yeah, like just as one example, there is no consistent place where sub-projects push their releases. So the Kubernetes releases are pushed to one particular place, but other. I did a quick survey of a few sub-projects, and like literally no two of them pushed their releases the same place. So that's probably not awesome for people, for users who are trying to pick these things up and determine whether they are legitimate and up to date and things like that. We will have to have some kind of policies around that sort of thing.
And another issue that I want to attack as part of this is there are people, including the CNCF, that put together sort of participation statistics for this company is participating, these developers, and all this stuff. As we move to a multi-repo thing, which repos are actually included in those statistics? How do we identify which of those repos? Because it's more than just Kubernetes, but we have projects that are significantly different, have different sort of ways of doing business. We want to maybe enable that, but should that then also count towards these, in my opinion, not necessarily useful, but very popular sort of, like leaderboards for participation.
So Matt, I'm not sure if we're making any forward progress in your mind on this topic, but I do think it's probably worth tabling for a couple of weeks until we have a steering committee, and then maybe bringing it up as part of the steering committee process.
Although I think what would be useful in the meantime is expanding on the small section that you have already written about how Cube Spray is different from COPS and how it builds on Cube ADM. I assume I interpreted your comments as
COPS also uses Cube ADM, so it's not different in that regard.
Right. So
COPS
it's not
right?
different in that regard.
COPS doesn't use Cube ADM. Justin has a long list of reasons that it can't use it right now.
Well, okay, so here's the thing.
I thought he said he did. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So Justin pulled in some libraries from Cube ADM, but he's not using the full meal deal from Cube ADM. And so I think it's a matter of, technically it's using some Cube ADM stuff, but I think there's work to be done to make sure that it can be used to the sort of fullest extent. So there's areas of gray and all.
I mean, I've got my so maybe we need to bring to the steering committee the topic of what needs to be done before the steering committee says they'll look at it, because it seems that this SIG will not consider endorsing projects going forward, or decide the fate of them when it comes around.
Like, graduation from incubation is not an endorsement.
I would say that
it's the end of some list, and it will have to be moved from the Kubernetes incubator space to somewhere.
I think what's missing here is just a well-defined process, right? For when, just a simple workflow that says when you should go through graduation from incubation, graduation, and when you should potentially glom onto some other process that allows you to be notified by the community that says you're part of the community and here's where you can go to find the bits, etc. It seems to me that this land of ambiguity is something that we live in. It's part of what the steering committee is meant to help solve. It's just a well-defined process. And I think in absence of a well-defined process, we don't want to commit to anything yet, is what it sounds like to me.
Right. So just as an example, in the incubation process, there's no clear process about what to do if somebody disagrees. Like, completely undocumented and unclear. So we're going to have to resolve those kinds of issues. Like, what does it mean to actually graduate from incubation? How does it work? How is the decision made? So those are the kinds of things that we need to take up. There was a question in the chat, why not graduate to become a CNCF project? So as a member of the CNCF Technical Oversight Committee and one of the primary decision makers in terms of what projects get into CNCF and not, my position, and I think the position of other TOC members, is that CNCF projects are intended to be broadly useful in the cloud native space, not tightly coupled to Kubernetes specifically. So I don't think there is a home for smaller projects, for Kubernetes specific projects in the CF. That's not really what we're looking for. It's not a good fit. I do think that the Kubernetes project itself does need to have a home for ecosystem projects, but this is not really the right place to discuss that. The steering committee will be taking up that issue. But just as a comparison, if you look at Node.js, the Node.js Foundation was originally designed to take in more projects than just Node.js. In practice, they only took one, which was Express. And otherwise, they decided they didn't want to take any more projects. So other projects that build in user space on top of Node.js get punted to the JavaScript Foundation, right? So there's another foundation where those projects that want a neutral home can land. It's kind of awkward. It's not a great fit for them either, but at least that's the workable solution. We don't really have that alternative here. So, if that is an issue you care about what project should be under the Kubernetes umbrella versus CNCF umbrella, that will be a topic taken up by the steering committee.
I've just got a couple of bits of feedback on this discussion. The first one is in terms of endorsement and this sort of question of what it means to endorse something. I think it would be entirely reasonable for it to be the remit of this SIG to document solutions that are out there. And I think that we already have that on the Kubernetes.io docs. I think that taking incremental improvements and contributions to those docs to make them more accurate, to reflect what is available to users at this point in time is reasonable. And I think that it's reasonable for us to review PRs to those docs and for us to help shepherd that process. I'm interested in knowing whether people agree with that.
Like it, I agree.
Yep.
Nobody disagrees. All
Cool.
tools that are available.
I will put one caveat that both Brian and or Joe were saying that we'd like to sort of shrink the number of sort of installers that we list on our page, and I think that as a SIG we can set up criteria, things like to be listed on that page, you should have a link to test grid where we can all look and see that you are passing conformance tests and you are passing upgrade tests. So
I don't want to conflate test grid, but yes, I think some value of conformance goodness is a good thing. But
absolutely, we should be able to reduce that list and still recommend things that are out there.
Yeah, so one big problem we had for a long time, even just with KubeUp, is that people who contributed the port of KubeUp to other platforms did not keep it up to date, right? So we had this big table in Markdown in the Kubernetes repo, and there were some that never got updated past 1.2 or something like that.
Mistakes were made. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we should not recommend tools that are not kept up to date.
Yeah, and I think some time ago we specifically proposed that we were going to do a sort of sweep of all of the tools out there and ping the maintainers if we could identify who they were and say, if your tool doesn't support, I think we said we were going to say, if your tool doesn't support upgrades, then we're going to take it off the list. And that
I think there are requirements like that we should have. You have to support upgrades. You have to support the latest release within N number of weeks, things like that.
Well, and you have to list the versions that you've qualified, right? And with some data to back it up, whether or not, it doesn't necessarily have to be test grid, but it has to be some
this is something that SIG testing and the conformance stuff is going through.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
I think there's a ton of discussions ongoing there.
But I think us defining the requirements, what it means to be on that list, and having a list that we curate seems totally legit.
Yeah, and that's got nothing to do with graduation or any other process. Okay, so that's the first thing. The other thing I just wanted to mention, so Brian, I think you brought up this idea of Kubernetes the hard way as part of the responsibility of the SIG. I do think that we have something that's kind of going to be close to that. I just wanted to mention, which is the documentation for the Q Adm Phases work, which is one of Lucas's sort of ongoing projects. I think that good documentation on what all the different phases are for the Q Adm Phases that document the inputs and the outputs of each phase more or less add up to a sort of Kubernetes the hardware document. As in, you can either run this Q Adm command, the Q Adm phase command, or you could go and do this blah, 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 document what you would actually have to do on the system. So I just wanted to draw that comparison because I think that's going to land soonish, and I think that gets us at least some of the way.
Yeah, that might be sufficient. So by the way, I just mentioned one thing. There are a number of mandates, I would say, that have been placed on cluster lifecycle, principally by me, such as the component configuration and add-ons and Kubernetes the hard way and whatever. If you don't actually have enough people to help with those things, I encourage you to advertise the need for people to take on specific tasks on Kubernetes dev. Because one thing, we have 200 some active contributors, but I think most people are involved in a small number of SIGs or don't even attend SIGs, and they aren't really sure where help is needed, and sifting through 4,000 GitHub issues is not an awesome way to figure that out. So without centralized management and effort distribution, it's a bit hard for people to engage in the places where there's the most need. So I occasionally post pleads for help, and I would have to say it has mixed success. But one example that I think has been reasonably successful is with the release team, where we define specific roles that need to be taken on, and we make sure that those roles get filled, and we ask for help until they get filled, right? So I think if this SIG could also identify these are the responsibilities of the SIG, this is something that the steering committee is going to ask to be put into the charter of the SIG once we have kind of a draft of what we want to see in a charter, but expect this to be coming. What is the scope of what this SIG is responsible for, and what specific things is the SIG responsible for? Define some roles around those responsibilities, and if you don't have people to fill those roles, please surface that to the broader community.
That's a good point. I think breaking those things out into defined roles would be easier way to find sort of chunks that we could hand to somebody and expand the set of folks working. So that sounds great.
So another thing, related to the previous discussion, we are going to need an official notion of sub-project. Just as an example, this SIG obviously has Q Adm, COPS, and other installers and add-ons and component config and whatever else. But like SIG network, take SIG network as an example. There's pod networking and network policy and ingress and DNS and probably other things that I'm forgetting, right? But lots of SIGs have multiple sub-projects, sometimes overlapping sets of people work on them, sometimes not. I think it will help everyone in the project understand what's going on if we have a better defined notion of what those sub-projects are, who the leads of those sub-projects are, and so on. So, whereas CubeSpray and COPS and Q Adm seem like very distinct projects, other SIGs don't have as distinct sub-projects yet. That is something we're going to have to do, is make sure every part of the project, the broader project, falls under the responsibility of some SIG, and specifically some sub-project of that SIG. So do think about like what other sub-projects are under the umbrella or should be under the umbrella of cluster lifecycle as well. Like just as one example that may not have occurred to you, Minikube is basically a flavor of cluster installer and lifecycle manager. I haven't really thought of a better SIG than cluster lifecycle for Minikube to land in. Pretty much it's been run autonomously, kind of disjoint from everything else. There was some people from the SIG, like Lucas, were involved with that at the beginning. But we're gonna have to pick a SIG. So it's probably gonna be this SIG, unless someone suggests a better one.
Well, I mean, is Minikube actually a Kubernetes project, or is this a good example of? It is. It really? I missed when that happened.
Well, we had previous to Minikube, if people don't remember, and we had Vagrant installed.
Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff.
A bunch of other things, and they all sucked and weren't really kept up to date. They weren't continuously tested. Minikube is such a leap forward for those things. Maybe it doesn't solve all problems, like it's only one node and things like that, but it is kept up to date with Kubernetes releases.
Oh yeah, it is.
Yeah. It does support add-ons. It is a project. It is hugely valuable. It has thousands, I think almost 10,000 weekly users at this point. So,
I think the biggest issue, I mean, like it's another great example of a place where the releases don't go to the same place. We're not testing Minikube on every, I can't do a Minikube of the latest stable, right? I mean, like it seems like the update mechanisms for that are pretty disjoint and manual. Does it still use Rocket under the covers?
I don't know.
Because that's not something that SIG-Node has signed up to support yet. So, yeah.
And there are things like that.
A lot of questions.
But it is very widely used. And
no doubt.
So I just want to, we kind of going in a circle here in a couple different, like where these projects will land and governance and other policies. I think at this point, we've pretty much punted on making a decision, other than documentation, which we agree upon. Are there other agenda topics that we wanted to discuss today? I just wanted to see if there are other things on the list that we wanted to get to.
I think there's one other agenda item today from Jace.
Well, Jace posted a link in chat, and I stuck it in there for him. And he linked to a GitHub issue about updating G-Cloud. So I was curious what he was looking for here. Jace, you there? I don't see him on the call. I poked Jeff Grafton about this a couple of days ago, and Jeff said that this was not a release blocker for 1.8, but at some point we'll have to backport the fix because G-Cloud keeps making backwards incompatible changes and breaking our test infrastructure as a result. So I'm not sure what he wanted to discuss about it. Jeff said that it was going to be worked on, but it's not urgent.
Are all the documentation updates for 1.8 in place now? Is there anything that's left? Is there any more release items for 1.8 that we're pending on?
I have one docs PR that needs tech review and then one that needs a little bit of cleanup. I posted it in Slack earlier.
Yeah, that was going to be my question as well. Like, how are we looking for 1.8? Any status from anyone?
I know that we do need to have docs in place, but I'm not. I don't think the hard deadline, because we might want to make some updates shortly after the release, depending upon when some other components land too. I think there will be some minor docs changes that are still required. I was supposed to do some of that, but I haven't really spent time on it.
Hi, Fabrizio Pandini speaking.
What was that?
I think
I'm
that was
working to an update.
yeah, so that was Fabrizio saying I think he's working on an update. Cool. Just looking back through the minutes from there was a meeting a little while ago where we enumerated the things that we were trying to get to land in time for 1.8. The looks like the pull request 4770 in the docs was merged 3 days ago. That's the Q Adm upgrade docs. So that's the only one I was tracking, but that doesn't mean it was the only one that is out there.
Yeah, at the Burndown meeting, they link to the open issues for the 1.8 milestone and say that all of them are blocking the release at this point, regardless of what the priority label is on them. There are currently 2 for our SIG. One is the one that Jace linked to, which I don't believe is blocking the 1.8 release. So I think we will just kick that out of the milestone. The second one is Lucas's Q Adm 1.8 release tracking issue, which is just sort of our, let's make sure that we stick the landing on Q Adm for 1.8 that we've missed in the past.
I think we should probably send out a general PSA for people to help review, because although we are writing docs, what typically has a tendency to happen is we do a quick turnkey shortly after the release because of oops, we missed something or it wasn't caught until after it went out the door. So if we want to do like an early PSA announcement to something to the effect of like, we have updated docs, we have everything in place, could you please take a walk through it?
And what's really helpful to have in those sort of updates or requests is whatever special instructions you need to try the latest like RC. What's the current status on RCs for 1.8? I mean, is there a nearly final version that you can install using the latest Q Adm, or?
I don't think we've cut any RCs yet. I think we're still cutting betas.
It would be helpful for me. I was trying to test something earlier and I thought I found a bug, but it was just a bug in the beta 1 that had been fixed. It'd be nice to have an RC.
I'll bring that up at the Burndown meeting in 12 minutes and see what people think.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, maybe if we go first RC, then a Q Adm PSA that goes along with it saying how to test it using Q Adm would be awesome, because then we could also encourage people to test the new Q Adm upgrade UX and things like that. Cool. Does anyone else have any status on other 1.8 issues? Does anyone have any other agenda items they would like to talk about? Cool. Well, in that case, unless there's anything else on the list, I didn't miss anything, did I? No? Cool. Well, I'll give everyone 10 minutes of their day back. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Luke.
Thanks all.